Okay, so let me start by welcoming everyone to Edward Hatchworth-Lee's presentation of his most recent book, The Coevolution, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines, which is edited, is published by MIT Press. Now, let me just give a short introduction to Edward's scientific background. So Edward is an emeritus professor now at UC Berkeley and also professor of the graduate school. He has been on the faculty at Berkeley since 1986, I believe, so fairly long time. Since that time, and even before that time, he has been one of the leaders in research, education, and knowledge transfer in the fields of electrical engineering and computer science, with special emphasis on cyber-physical systems. These are systems that combine physical dynamics with digital control, with software and networking. So it's a natural point of connection between classical electrical engineering and the digital aspects, the software aspects of computer science. Edward is the author of over 300 scientific papers, at least, I think, 8 monographs and textbooks, and more recently, 2 books that I think play a very interesting, a very important role in bringing topics related to computer science and engineering and making them available to a general public in a thought-provoking way. The first book is Plato and the Nerd, and the second one is the one that Edward is about to present to us today. Interestingly, today at the Gran Sasso Science Institute, there was a talk in physics about a project called Ptolemy. And actually, Ptolemy is one of the projects for which Edward is best known, I think, in the computer science community. It's an open source package based on the actor model of concurrent computation for essentially developing reliable cyber-physical systems and doing modern systems theory. I like to think of Edward also as an enlightened engineer, somebody who still encapsulates the ideal of the Renaissance man. And this, I think, is clear to everyone who reads Plato and the Nerd and the Coevolution. And I believe that after this talk, there will be a few more readers of both of these books. To wit, Edward is one of the co-signatories of the Vienna Manifesto for Digital Humanism, just like Moshe Vardi, whom we had as a speaker about 3 weeks ago in this colloquium series. Without further ado, you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Edward. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Much appreciated. So it's a real honor to be here, and in some ways, we're all learning how to do these kinds of meetings. And in some ways, you know, for most of my recent life, I have spent a vast amount of my time on airplanes traveling around the world. And in some ways, we have new opportunities here because, giving this little overview to primarily people in Iceland and Italy would have been rather difficult to arrange before all of this. So there are some upsides, perhaps. All right, so what I'd like to do today is give you a brief introduction of my new book, The Coevolution, The Entwined Futures of Humans and Machines. This was just published by MIT Press, released April 20th, with what is probably the ultimate of poor timing in the midst of this pandemic. In fact, it was released the very same week that Amazon was threatening to shut down their non-essential product distribution mechanisms, including books, which they deemed to be non-essential. Now, I'd like to point out right up front that I have made a commitment to donate all of the future royalties that I get from this book to the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the organization that supports Wikipedia. And for this reason, one of the reasons I chose to do that is, first of all, I love Wikipedia. I think it's a fabulous resource. But in addition, it makes me, in the past, I've been embarrassed promoting my books if there's potential financial gain. I've never really made much money off of books, but I won't be making any off of this book. And so I'm a little less hesitant to actually promote it. And one of my goals in promoting it is actually to get dialogue going among the technical community. I think that to some degree, I am finding that me and my colleagues are much more at the center of really profound cultural changes that are happening to humans. And I think that this idea of coevolution is actually very pertinent right now in the face of this pandemic, because one of the things I've learned a lot about how biological evolution works in the course of researching for this book. And one of the things that I have learned is that I used to think that biological evolution was a fairly slow, gradual process, but actually it isn't. It's more like punctuated equilibrium. So there tend to be short periods of time where very rapid changes happen in biological evolution. And the coevolution that I talk about in my book is undergoing a punctuated point in its evolutionary process right now. We are getting ourselves much more integrated with technology and using technology in ways that is really profoundly different and new to many of us. Here's a snapshot from my group meeting last week. And you can see various artifacts, including people whose heads are not completely there, people wearing headsets, people scattered around the globe. My research group is now not all in Berkeley. A few of them are, but they're actually all over the world now. And this was one of the meetings that we had. The graduation ceremony that was held at Berkeley just this last weekend was held in Minecraft. A group of about 100 undergraduate students undertook an enormous project starting about a month ago to build a replica of the Berkeley campus inside of Minecraft. They call it the Blockley campus, and it is sort of very blocky. You can see in this image that even the clouds are very block-shaped in Minecraft. And they held a virtual graduation ceremony inside of this game over this last weekend with the chancellor giving speeches, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a little snapshot of a one-on-one conversation with one of my graduate students, Gil Lederman. And this again was taken just last week. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that Gil is looking directly at my eyes as he sees them on his screen. And I'm looking directly at his eyes as I see them on my screen. But neither of us is looking at each other, and we don't get this sense of human-to-human contact, eye contact that you have. This is, of course, a big issue with giving talks like this as well. I can't see you, and it's a little difficult, and I'm learning to speak to my screen and try to remind myself constantly that there are actually people out there that I am connecting with, and it's a little bit hard to do, and it's in some ways not natural for human beings to do this. So my book is really about this relationship that humans have with technology and how the humans are changed by the technology. Not just that humans change technology, but that humans are changed by technology, and that there's this feedback loop where when the humans are changed by technology and then they go and they further change that technology, the process that results is much more of an evolutionary process than I had previously realized in my own course of my career. So in some ways, the very short summary of my book might be that we humans actually have less control than we think over technology development. And I think this has pretty profound implications. It implies that policy is both more important and perhaps more difficult to make effective than it might seem. Our naive approaches to technology policy may not actually accomplish what we would like to accomplish. So my book is not a doomsday book. There's a lot of books out there that talk about the runaway exponential growth in machine intelligence and how it's going to eliminate all the jobs that humans do today, and how it's going to make humans irrelevant and make us unnecessary and run off without us. That's not the topic of my book. I do recommend reading these books. One of my favorites is this very recently released one called Human Compatible, published by my colleague Stuart Russell, which is about the problem of ensuring that AIs develop in a way that is aligned with the interests of humans. And it takes as a premise that this runaway explosion of intelligence is inevitable and will leave us sidelined. So that's not the topic of my book. In fact, my book is not really about the future of technology. It's about the present. It's about trying to understand our human relationship with technology today. So it takes a perspective that it is, to me, profoundly embarrassing that it took me so long to realize this, okay? I've been working primarily in the area of embedded software for 40 years. I was writing embedded software in the 1970s. And for my entire career, until quite recently, I had this assumption, which I now call digital creationism, that technology is the result of top-down intelligent design. That every piece of software that I wrote was the creative output of my brain, my own cognitive self, actually creating these things, and that it was the result of my thought processes and my deliberate decisions. I no longer believe that this is really the case. I think that, in fact, our mental cognitive processes are in some ways cogs in a relentless and perhaps purposeless evolution. And if we understand that that is how technology comes about, it changes a great deal how we approach trying to regulate it and control it. So that's really the thesis that I try to develop in my book. And it's a deeply nuanced thesis, and it requires a fairly deep dive into what evolution really is and what software development really is. So the focus of my book is on digital technologies. It's not on a lot of other technologies that are just as important and having a huge impact on humanity, but it's primarily, it's really about digital technologies and software. And so what I'm going to do is pick a few highlights in the book of a subset of the chapters in the book, and try to tell you a little bit of the story that the chapters develop. So the very first chapter develops this metaphor where you can start to think of software artifacts as if they were living. And I call them living digital beings, or which I have in the past shortened to the acronym LDB, which then in my informal conversation, which I've had many discussions with people over years about this, I started just calling them LDBs, and that sort of became a word. And in fact, in my early drafts of the book, I referred to them throughout the book as LDBs. The publisher did not like that. The publisher thought the word LDB was silly, and it would undermine the story in my book, which is a fairly serious story, to have a silly word for this metaphor. So the publisher forced me to sort of purge the book almost entirely of this word LDB, but I still use it occasionally in informal conversation. So I think of an artifact like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a software artifact. This image that you're seeing on the screen is actually a picture of one of the Wikipedia servers. Wikipedia runs 5 data centers around the world, and each data center has dozens or even hundreds of servers in it. And this is a picture of one of those. And the metaphor that I'd like you to consider is to think of this as if it were a living thing. Now, what does this really mean? I'll get into that in a little bit more depth, but this metaphor is fairly easy to understand. Wikipedia started interacting with its environment in I think it was 2001. I don't remember exactly the year off the top of my head, but it's been operating ever since. with only brief interruptions. It's been interacting with its environment. It started executing on a single server. It has grown to hundreds of servers. None of the servers that it uses today are, it doesn't include the original server that it started on when it was first launched. This is actually not unlike a human body. Most of the cells in my body are not the same cells as the ones that I was born with. And I have been more or less continually reacting to my environment since I was born. So this relationship, which I go into in a lot more depth in the book, is something that I'd like you to consider as a key part of the relationship that humans have with technology. Now, the second key theme is that we have less control than we think over the development of this technology. So it's technology as evolution rather than top-down intelligent design. This image shows a picture of me in front of a ship that was launched in the year 1628 in Sweden. It was commissioned by Gustav II Adolf, the king of Sweden at the time, to be used in a war that was going on between Sweden and Poland at the time. And about 1,500 meters into its maiden voyage, the ship heeled over slightly and started taking on water over through the lower gun decks and promptly sank to the bottom. And approximately 30 of the 200 people on board died in that event. Now, this was a pretty poor piece of engineering. And I'd like to read you a quote from Alain, the French philosopher Alain, whose real name is Émile Auguste Chartier. So he said, "Every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It is clear that a very badly made boat will end up at the bottom after one or two voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others." So Alain is saying here that the boat designers weren't really doing top-down intelligent design. They were doing mutation. They were taking previous designs and permuting them in various ways. I have realized that every piece of software that I have ever written in my 40-year career is a mutation of some previous piece of software. This idea that a software engineer starts with a blank slate and creates something out of nothing is simply an illusion. It's a delusion even. So what does it mean to be really thinking of these technological artifacts as living? I mentioned that Wikipedia responds to its environment, but that's not enough to be considered living. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page on life, it has this image. This image reflects a perspective, only one perspective. There's no agreement among biologists about what it really means to be alive. But according to this perspective, there are 7 requirements to be alive. And these are the 7 that are identified in this particular interpretation of what is life. And every one of these actually has at least a strong analogy with what is going on with Wikipedia. Wikipedia certainly has cellular structure and composition. You saw the hundreds of servers, the image with the hundreds of servers and scattered across the planet. It certainly has growth and development. It started on a single server. Does it have metabolism? Well, if you define metabolism in biological terms, then no, obviously it doesn't. But if you define metabolism as deriving energy from chemical reactions, then arguably it does actually, because in fact, the energy that drives Wikipedia is driven probably primarily from burning natural gas. At least in the US, that's the primary mechanism for electric power generation. Not in Iceland, it's geothermal there. So that's a different sort of derivation, but nevertheless, there is energy that is, produced in some way. So that's a bit of a stretch. Homeostasis is a bit less of a stress, right? Homeostasis is the idea of an organism maintaining stable inner conditions. And the fact is that every data center has computer-controlled air conditioning systems that maintain a stable temperature. The chips themselves have voltage regulators on board that maintain stable voltages in the presence of variable power supply voltages. So there are analogies to biological homeostasis. But to me, the most interesting ones are reproduction and heredity. Does Wikipedia reproduce? Well, if you go to GitHub, you'll find thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of wikis out there that are not Wikipedia, but are clearly fashioned after it, and in fact probably share quite a bit of code with Wikipedia. So heredity seems to be a feature here as well, particularly if you consider the software. I use the term codome for the unit of heritable traits in these living digital beings. You consider the software to be this unit of heritable trait. Most pieces of software inherit code from earlier pieces of software. So there does seem to be reproduction and heredity in some ways. Of course, the reproduction is happening almost entirely with tremendous help from humans, but not entirely, in fact. It is possible for living digital beings to reproduce by themselves. Computer viruses, in particular, are a primary example of that. Now, I'm not the first person to draw this analogy between technology and living things. In fact, Kevin Kelly, who was the founding executive editor of Wired magazine, talks about the technium. He coined the term technium for the seventh kingdom of life. There's, I guess, a vague consensus among biologists that life can be divided up into 6 kingdoms. I don't know that that has any kind of universal agreement, and it's fairly arbitrary, but nevertheless, departing from that, Kevin Kelly says that, well, maybe technology is a 7th kingdom of life. And he wrote this wonderful book and gave a wonderful TED talk on this, where he talks about the relationship between humans and technology as if the technology is living. Now, he includes in his view of technology, technologies that are not so dynamic. He talks about a coronet, a musical instrument, as being a living technological thing, mostly focusing on the heritability of traits from one version of a coronet to another. But to me, to be living, it's got to be dynamic. So quoting one of my favorite philosophers, Daniel Dennett, this is actually an indirect quote. It's a quote of Douglas Hofstadter quoting Daniel Dennett. Douglas Hofstadter is another one of my favorite philosophers. But according to Hofstadter, Daniel Dennett expressed this very nicely, saying, "It ain't the meat, it's the motion." Hofstadter says that this is a somewhat subtle hat tip to the title of a somewhat unsubtle, clearly erotic song written in 1951. But the key idea here is that life is a process, not a thing. If you look at a biological organism, when the processes stop, it's no longer alive, even though the material thing is still pretty much the same. It's the process that is life, not the thing. And as such, in the context of living digital beings, it's not the program that is alive, it's the execution of the program. It's not the computer that's alive, it's the program running on the computer that's alive. I don't think it's accidental, by the way, that Daniel Dennett sports this beard that I think he cultivates to look like Charles Darwin. This is a picture of Charles Darwin, because Daniel Dennett really has emphasized the role of evolutionary processes in much more than just the development of biology. So I mentioned briefly that it is in fact possible for these living digital beings to reproduce on their own. This is an image of a hex dump of a computer virus. This is actually a worm, not a computer virus. There's a technical distinction between the two. You can see on the right of the screen an ASCII reinterpretation of these bits, and there you can see that there's a hidden message to Bill Gates in the object code for this worm. Now, one of the things I talk about in my book is that there is this ability that that software has to actually reproduce largely on its own. But for the most part, reproduction is still requiring midwifing in a big way and husbandry by human beings. That may not continue. The trajectory is certainly much more towards software that is developing itself, but more interestingly, the software is developing itself with humans in the loop of that software development. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. I talk in my book about this, the introduction, the initial computer viruses that showed up were treated as pranks. When the field grew up, they moved from pranks to crimes. This is the code from a blaster worm, which was quite a devastating, one of the first really devastating computer viruses that propagated. There's less malicious forms of digital life that one can find. This is an image from John Horton Conway's Game of Life. John Conway, unfortunately, actually died last month of COVID-19. We're very sorry to lose him. But he invented this really wonderful game that showed mechanism by which relatively simple rules relating simple digital automata could lead to very lifelike behavior. And quite a few people have run with this and developed it much more in depth as an argument. In fact, some people go as far as to say that all of life must be a consequence of these kinds of simple digital interactions. I, in fact, counter that argument. I dispute that point in my book, but nevertheless, I do talk about that perspective as well. So there's been a long history of this study of lifelike behavior in the software, but my book tries to go into really much more depth and really relate it to what, in a way, I make the case that what we're seeing in technology development today is like the very earliest stages of the development of life on Earth. Now, the reality is that we don't really know much about how life developed on Earth. This is an image depicting a famous experiment that was conducted in 1934 called the Miller-Urey experiment. And Stanley Miller, who's shown in this picture, showed that the conditions on early Earth were actually conducive to, he showed a mechanism by which amino acids could develop out of the conditions on early Earth. But this is really a far cry. Amino acids are simply the building blocks of biological life. They're a far cry from the self-sustaining, self-reproducing molecules that make up life today. And nobody really knows how that gap was closed and how these amino acids developed into self-sustaining, self-reproducing chemicals. But what we are seeing in the digital world today is a slow but steady trajectory towards self-reproducing, self-sustaining digital artifacts. And so it could really be analogous to the development of a new life form on the planet. Now, I'm going to skip a few chapters in my book and cut right to chapter 7. But in chapter 7, I actually take the countervailing view. So my book argues with itself. I present this metaphor of thinking of digital technology as a living thing. And then in chapter 7, I emphasize the ways in which digital technology is really different from human beings. And in particular, I focus on a thesis that is relatively recent in psychology, at least recent in terms of becoming fairly mainstream, called embodied cognition. So Esther Tellin was one of the developmental psychologists that first really, I think, brought to respectability this perspective. And here's a quote from Esther Tellin where she says, "The mind simply does not exist as something decoupled from the body and the environment in which it resides." So this is counter to a sort of naive view of cognition, which is that cognition is a machine operating in my brain. Some people think it's a digital machine, in fact, a computation operating in my brain, responding to sensory input from the outside world and producing reactions in the outside world, like this motion of my hand. Well, the embodied cognition perspective says baloney. That's not what cognition is. Cognition is actually the interaction between the brain and its environment. And that if you don't have the body and the environment, you don't actually have cognition. And so this is a distinctly non-computational and non-objective, but rather subjective view of what cognition is. Now, there's quite a few people who have been exploring this idea in the context of living digital beings. There's this wonderful project. Josh Bongard is one of the leaders on this project for developing embodied robotics. So an embodied robot is one that actually learns about its own limbs and learns to interact with its environment by trying things out. And as a consequence, it develops a capability. In this case, the robot learns to walk by experimenting with its own body, and it can adapt. You can take one of these robots and pull off one of its legs, and it'll struggle for a while. It won't be able to walk like it could before when it had the full complement of legs, but it learns then to adapt to that newly revised structure in its body. So this idea of embodied robotics, I think, is it's an early stage technology, but it is suggesting that in fact, these living digital beings may start to become much more embodied. And we are seeing digital technologies engaging with their physical environment much more intensively. And I think that in some ways, this makes them less digital. It makes them less of computations and a little bit more like the human beings around us. Now, this question, at the same time that these robots are becoming less digital, they're interacting with an analog and physical world, many people actually believe that the human mind really is ultimately just a Turing machine operating on digital data. And my book disputes this. I argue very strongly against this. In chapter 8, which is entitled, Am I Digital?, I look at this question of whether I, as a human cognitive entity, am ultimately essentially equivalent to a digital computational process. This is a very nuanced argument. And one of the things, you can immediately look at, well, what are the consequences of this? If I am ultimately a digital computational process, then in principle, if the technology advances enough, I should be able to upload my soul into a computer and become immortal. I should be able to teleport, transmit my essence, my essential being over some radio waves, right? So these things are in principle possible if I am in fact a digital computational process. I give an argument in my book, and I don't give the complete argument because the complete argument is actually, it relies on some mathematics, and it would be inappropriate in this book to go into that mathematics, but I do give pointers to where you can read up more on this in the book. But the essential point that I make is that I borrow a term from Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Deus, where he coined the term dataism. And I'm arguing that dataism is a faith, not a scientific principle. And I argue that this principle, this idea, this premise that I am a digital computational, that I am at my essence a digital and computational process, that hypothesis is not falsifiable by experiment. And as a consequence, it can never constitute a scientific theory. It can only be taken on faith. The argument ultimately depends on a result shown by Claude Shannon in 1948. It's a result that a noisy channel cannot convey more than a finite number of bits. And you'll have to read my book to understand that argument in some depth. I can't really give you the full thrust of it here. But the essence of it is that I ask you to consider the possibility that this dataist hypothesis that we are ultimately digital and computational in our very nature may actually be flawed. And in fact, it is not a testable hypothesis, and consequently, we're never going to be able to develop it as a scientific thesis. So in chapter 10 in my book, I look at the question of accountability. And here it's addressing the issue of, well, as we're turning over more of the functioning of human society over to AIs, at what point are we going to find ourselves having to hold the AIs accountable for their actions, right? If a self-driving car has an accident, who's responsible? That kind of question. And this is a very deep question. This particular image shows an artwork that was created by a group of 3 artists in France who call themselves Obvious. Pierre Fautrel is shown in the image. He's one of the 3 artists. And it's a very interesting and I think historic artwork because it was essentially declared to be by these 3 artists the first artwork made by an AI. And it was sold at Christie's at auction for $432,000. This created an enormous controversy, of course, because ultimately this artwork was created using software that was written by a teenager, Robbie Barat, who is now a student at Stanford. And they didn't really make much in the way of changes to his program. And Robbie Barat's program was based on a technique that was developed by Ian Goodfellow called generative adversarial networks. And so who created this artwork? Was it really the AI? Was it these artists in France? My take on it in my book is that actually the artwork here is a piece of conceptual artwork. The idea of a first artwork created by an AI and the controversy and the thought that it provoked is the work of art that sold for $432,000, not the thing printed on canvas and put in that gold leaf frame. Okay, it's a piece of conceptual artwork, and to me a very interesting one because it's addressing this question of accountability headfirst from an artistic perspective. Now, this question of accountability gets very gnarly, as you can well imagine. I mean, it's gnarly even when we talk just about humans. When we start to introduce machines, well, one of the things I point out in my book is we can take a lot of fundamentally deep and old philosophical questions that have been asked about humans, and when we ask those same questions about machines, it changes the question. And we can get new insights into the question by asking these questions about machines. So in order to have accountability, you have to have a notion of causation. You can't hold something accountable for an action it didn't cause. Well, it turns out that causation is itself a problematic idea. And there's a debate among philosophers about whether the notion of causation is actually a human cognitive construct as opposed to something rooted in physics. This debate was launched first famously by Bertrand Russell in 1913, who said in a very colorful way, he said, "The law of causality, I believe, like much that passes muster among philosophers, is a relic of a bygone era, surviving like the monarchy only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm." So Bertrand Russell sort of threw out this challenge saying, we talk about causation all the time. Scientists talk about it, but if you look at the root of our scientific theses, they don't actually require it. And so causation may itself be a human cognitive construct rather than something actually rooted in the physics. So I talk about that in this book, and I leverage the work of a Turing Award winner, Judea Pearl, who argues, and I think very forcibly argues, that reasoning about causation requires first-person subjective involvement. And as a consequence, you can't separate reasoning about causation from a sense of self, a first person, an identity like the identity that we all have, and I infer that you have it like I have it, but we can't directly observe it in each other. It's only something that's very indirect. It's fundamentally subjective. So this question then, when addressed to machines, becomes, if machines are going to be able to be held accountable, they're going to have to reach the point where they can reason about causation, which means they're going to have to be able to have a subjective first-person involvement in things. What does it mean for a machine to have a first-person subjective involvement in the things it's interacting with? So that question is a very deep question. And in some ways, my book is more about trying to tease apart the subtleties and the nuances in that question, not about trying to give you an answer to that question. So chapter 13 addresses the question of pathologies. And this picture is not the coronavirus spread around the world. This is an image from my book. This is the spread of the WannaCry ransomware internet worm in 2017. It bears an actually pretty interesting resemblance to at least early spread of the coronavirus. But in this book, I talk about the idea that when things go wrong, when digital technologies lead to global pandemics like this ransomware pandemic, we should be treating these as pathologies, as an illness in an ecosystem, not as an invasion from an alien species. I think many of the doomsday books think of technology in the future as being more like an alien species that has sidelined human beings. In my book, I'm not saying that bad things won't happen. Quite the contrary. Bad things are inevitable. But I'm saying that the way that we should approach mitigating those bad things is to treat them as illnesses, not invasions. And I think that the way that we dealt with the WannaCry ransomware internet worm was, in fact, to inoculate machines with antibodies. It had very much analogies to the way we deal with pandemics, biological pandemics, in the ideal world. We hope we will be able to deal with the coronavirus pandemic in a similar way. So I also look at this question of, the partnership between humans and machines. And to me, when I talk about the coevolution of humans and machines, I find the human part of the partnership much scarier than the machine part, which is a significant departure from what these doomsday books have. So the final chapter that I'd like to talk about briefly is chapter 14, which kind of pulls together the ideas throughout the book and talks about the idea that humans and machines are co-evolving. And one of the things that I had to do in this book was to really dive into what evolution really means. And I learned a lot in the process of researching it. And I really recommend this book by David Quammen, because it takes a lot of very deep ideas from biology and makes them very accessible to a non-biologist like me. The essence of the book is that it shows that biological evolution is not as simple as we once thought. So I used to think that the way Darwinian evolution happened was random mutations would occur to DNA, for example, caused by chemicals in the environment or by alpha particles or cosmic rays. And that these random mutations in genetic material would create mutations in the creatures, and sometimes those mutations would be beneficial, and so they would propagate. But it turns out that evolution in biology is a lot more complicated than that. And in fact, that random evolution story can't explain a lot of what we see when biology evolves rapidly. So for example, the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. If you come up with the computer models for random evolution of bacteria, you can show that it doesn't explain the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It can't be the mechanism, because the mechanism wouldn't be fast enough to account for the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So biologists have identified quite a number of other mechanisms that occur. So one of the ones that I talk about in my book is this idea of horizontal gene transfer. So the way that this works is that you have a virus. It turns out a lot of viruses attack bacteria, when a virus that attacks bacteria is called a bacteriophage. And normally what happens when one of these bacteriophages attacks the bacteria is it takes over the genetic mechanism in the bacteria and then uses that hijacks it to create replicas of the virus, which then propagate. Now, it turns out that these propagating replicas of the bacteria carry pieces of the DNA, these propagating replicas of the virus, they carry chunks of the DNA from the bacterium. And sometimes when a bacteriophage approaches a bacterium, it doesn't successfully invade it and destroy the cell, but it can transfer some of the DNA that it brought from the previous bacteria, and that DNA gets spliced into the DNA of this new bacterium, which then goes on to reproduce. Okay, so this is horizontal gene transfer, one of the mechanisms that have been relatively recently identified that affect biological evolution. So how does this relate to software? Well, if you look at what a software engineer does, a software engineer does not start with a blank slate. The only place that software engineer starts with a blank piece of paper and starts writing software is when you're taking an introductory programming class and the instructor tells you that's what you have to do. And even then, introductory programming classes don't do that. You don't start with a blank slate. Instead, what you do is you pull together pieces of code from various libraries, like the standard template library, the Java library, Python modules, JavaScript modules. You download code from GitHub. You look on Stack Overflow for ways that people have approached this particular problem. And you pull together pieces of what I call codome, the genetic material in software. So the software engineer here is really operating more like a virus, stitching together pieces of code that other people have written. Now, there's another mechanism that has strongly affected biological evolution that is really quite different from the random mutation. And again, you can read about this in Kwamin's book. But this is a mechanism called endosymbiosis that was first brought to respectability by Lynn Margulis. And this is an idea about how eukaryotic cells, which are the cells in the human body and in plants, so plants and animals, all of our cells are eukaryotic, which means that they have organelles within them. Unlike bacterial cells, they have nuclei, they have mitochondria, etc. The endosymbiosis theory says that the way these cells came about was not by some random mutation in DNA occurring that caused these organelles to appear, but rather in a cartoon-like way. You can think of a bacterium ingesting another bacterium and instead of digesting it, making it part of its own metabolism. So a symbiosis emerges where a new organism comes about from a binding together of the previous organisms. And of course, you can see how this would lead further to multicellular organisms developing, where they start as colonies of single cellular organisms, and then those colonies themselves start to develop an entity of their own. So this kind of thing, I think, is happening between humans and technology today, where we are in fact integrating technology into our very selves. And in some ways, we are becoming cyborgs in the process. The technology is changing us. I'd like to look at this just a little more deeply, and I'll end in just a minute. A lot of the people who fear AI are worried about this question of whether computers will learn to write their own programs, okay? Because that's kind of a prerequisite to this runaway exponential explosion where the machines sideline the humans. But there's an interesting phenomenon that's already happening, which is that computers teach humans to program. I've been writing software for 40 years, and my productivity writing software is orders of magnitude now than it was even 10 years ago. And it's in large part because of the software tools that I'm using to write the software. The software tools are teaching me how to program. They're guiding my thought process. The programming languages, which are themselves evolved over many generations, are shaping my thoughts as I write code. Programs are teaching programmers to program, and they're teaching the programmers who write the tools that are used to teach the next generation of programmers. There's this feedback loop. So humans are part of this feedback loop. So if you think of technology developing this way, there's implications to regulation, of course. So let me talk about policy implications. So here's a quote, direct quote from my book. Under digital creationism, bad outcomes are the result of unethical actions by individuals, for example, by blindly following the profit motive with no concern over societal effects. Under coevolution, bad outcomes are the result of procreative prowess. Technologies that succeed are those that more effectively propagate. So we need to rethink how we develop policies, I think, in view of this. So that my conclusion is we nudge rather than control technology development. We change as technology changes, and only with a deeper understanding of these coevolutionary processes can we have any hope of effective policies that ensure that technology serves humanity. Thanks very much. And I will stop here and open up the floor to questions.